In this Avatar The Last Airbender draft guide, I will be providing you with all of the information you need to know before diving into the format. I will be discussing the set mechanics, the top commons for each color, I will provide archetype overviews, go through the combat tricks you need to be aware of, cover some traps to avoid, combos you can assemble, and more. Kicking things off with the set mechanics, they are Airbend, Waterbend, Earthbend, and Firebending. Airbend is a mechanic found on a card like Aang, the Last Airbender, who is a 4-mana 3/2 flyer that says, when Aang enters, airbend up to one other target non-land permanent. So you exile it. While it's exiled, its owner may cast it for 2 generic mana rather than its mana cost. So with airbending, it's important to read each specific card because some of them have restrictions, like only being able to airbend your own non-land permanents or things like that. But basically, you exile the card. The person can then cast it later for 2 generic mana, which means that you can use it on your own creatures to maybe re-trigger an enters the battlefield effect, or you can use it on your opponent's creature if that's an option to make them recast and get a bit of tempo advantage. Aang also does mention that whenever you cast a lesson, Aang gains lifelink until end of turn, and lessons are a subtype found on instants and sorceries in the set, and then there's cards that care about lessons. Aang is also an ally, which is a subtype found on creatures in this set, and there are cards that care about allies as well. The next mechanic is Waterbend, which is found on activated abilities. So the activated ability will say something like Waterbend 6, draw a card, in the case of Katara Bending Prodigy, and while paying a Waterbend cost, you can tap your artifacts and creatures to help. Each one pays for 1 generic mana. So you could theoretically not tap a single one of your lands to pay a Waterbend cost if you had enough artifacts and creatures that were helping out, but basically it's an activated ability that you can then use your creatures and artifacts to help pay for. Next is Earthbend, which is a mechanic that says target land you control becomes a 0/0 creature with haste that's still a land. Put a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the Earthbend number. So in the case of Toph, that is Earthbend 2. And so you'll put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. When it dies or is exiled, return it to the battlefield tapped. So if your opponent does kill your land creature, it will come back into play, so you can still use it to cast your spells later on in the game. Though if they do something like a bounce spell or something that puts it directly into your deck, that land will still be gone because it wouldn't have died or been exiled. So just keep that in mind, but Earthbend basically turns your lands into creatures. Next is Firebending, which is a mechanic that says whenever this creature attacks, add an amount of mana equal to the Firebending number. So in the case of Zuko, Exiled Prince, you're adding 3 because he has Firebending 3. So you get 3 red mana, and this mana lasts until the end of combat. So you can use that to activate abilities. So Zuko has an activated ability that costs 3 mana, and you can also use it to cast things like instants and things like that. Moving on to the top commons, starting off with white. At number 1, we have Airbending Lesson, just a very flexible instant. You can use this to protect your own cards from removal in some ways by like airbending them away and then recasting them later. You can use this to reset enters the battlefield effects that you might care about, and then you can also use this on your opponent's non-land permanents, maybe if you just want to get a little bit of tempo, or if they go for a combat trick, or if they have a bunch of +1/+1 counters on the creature that you want to reset. Airbending Lesson can help with that, and the fact that it replaces itself by drawing a card is really nice, and it is a lesson for cards that care about that synergy. Next is Kyoshi Warriors, just a really nice rate for a creature, 4 mana for a 3/3, and a 1/1 buddy. They're both allies, which is really good for decks that care about allies. They provide you with a token that you can sacrifice for decks that care about sacrificing things. Really just a nice card that's going to be one you're happy to play every time you can. And then at number 3, we have Path to Redemption, which is a pretty efficient removal spell. 2 mana, the enchanted creature can't attack or block. Then eventually you can get rid of it for good and even get a 1/1 ally by paying 5 mana, sacrificing it to exile the enchanted creature. The reason it's at number 3 instead of a little bit higher, though, is because the opponent can airbend their creature away while it's got Path to Redemption on it, which will make the Path to Redemption fall off. And so that does make it a little bit worse. And also there are sacrifice cards in this set. So if you put the Path to Redemption on the creature, it still can sacrifice itself. It still can be used to tap to be help with water bending. So there are cards that make Path to Redemption worse, but it's still an efficient card, and even if it's only temporary as an answer in many cases, it's still a card you'll be happy to have. Next, moving on to blue, at number 1 is Forecasting Fortune Teller. So for 2 mana, you get a 1/3, and when this creature enters, create a clue token, which is an artifact with 2, sacrifice this token, draw a card. So that clue token, importantly, can be used to help pay for waterbending costs. So before you have the time to maybe sacrifice that clue, Forecasting Fortune Teller provides you with 2 things that can tap themselves, the Forecasting Fortune Teller itself and your clue token, to help pay for waterbending costs, which is really nice, and it's a 2 mana 1/3 that will eventually replace itself. There are decks that care about drawing 2 cards in a turn, so the clue can help with that, and so the Fortune Teller just does good work. At number 2 is Rowdy Snowballers, a really nice tempo play. A 3 mana 2/2, when it enters, you tap a creature and put a stun counter on it. So that's going to make sure that you can help maybe come back if your opponent has gotten off to a fast start, stop them from getting their firebending triggers by attacking for a turn. If you can tap down a firebender, it's an ally, so there are going to be some synergies with that. And overall, just a card that you're going to be pretty happy playing on turn 3 or even later in the game. Then at number 3 is Lost Days. So for 5 mana, it's an instant. The owner of target creature or enchantment puts it into their library, second from the top or bottom, and you create a clue token. So it is expensive at 5 mana, but it is going to give you a clue token, so it's going to eventually replace itself, and it will be able to deal with earthbended lands pretty effectively, because you can just put it into their library, so they won't get to then search up another land because it didn't die or get exiled. So that's quite nice. And also just replacing yourself as a removal spell is going to be something you're going to be happy to have, and it's a lesson for the synergies that care about that. Next is black, and first up we have Sold Out. So 4 mana for an instant, exile target creature. If it was dealt damage this turn, create a clue token. So Sold Out, just a nice removal spell. It's going to deal with the cards you care about dealing with, and then sometimes you'll be able to even do something like chump block a creature and then use your Sold Out in case you want to just turn one of your random 1/1 creatures into a clue token or something like that. So that's just something that's nice to be aware of. Next up is Callous Inspector. So it's a 1/1 menace for 1, and when it dies, it deals 1 damage to you, create a clue token. This card is just an excellent synergy piece for the black decks in this format. There are decks that care about sacrificing cards. Callous Inspector fits well there. There are decks that care about putting +1/+1 counters on creatures. Callous Inspector with menace is a pretty good place to put +1/+1 counters that you can play early in the game. And then there's just the aggressive black decks, and having a 1/1 menace that chips in for a little bit before eventually being turning into a clue is also something you're going to be pretty happy with. So Callous Inspector is a nice addition to your black decks. Then at number 3, speaking of sacrifice cards, there's Deadly Precision. You can play 1 black mana, and then as an additional cost to cast it, you either pay 4 generic mana or sacrifice an artifact or creature, and you will destroy target creature. And so Deadly Precision, another nice removal spell for black that fits especially well into sacrifice decks. Next up is red. At number 1 is Firebending Lesson. So for 1 mana, you can deal 2 damage to target creature, or you can kick it and pay 5 mana to deal 5 damage to that creature. It's a cheap lesson to fuel your synergies with that, and it's a very versatile removal spell that is at instant speed, and you're going to love to have it. And number 2 is Lightning Strike. 2 mana, deal 3 to any target. It's perfect as a removal spell in the early games. You can even use it to finish off your opponent in the late game. Definitely a card you are going to be very happy having. And then at number 3 is Deserter's Disciple. So it's a 2 mana 2/2, so pretty reasonable stats for the early game, and then it has the activated ability of making another target creature you control with power 2 or less that can't be blocked this turn. So even in the late game, your opponent's going to be really threatened by this card, because if you can get them low, you can use your Deserter's Disciple to start pushing through damage still, and so your opponent's going to have to answer it in the late game, which is really nice for a 2-drop that's also going to be a potential problem in the early turns just as an attacker and blocker. So Deserter's Disciple, pretty nice there. Moving on to green, at number 1 is Rocky Rebuke. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature an opponent controls at instant speed for just 2 mana is something you're going to be very happy having in green decks. It's pretty much the best type of removal green will get these days at common, and so you're going to be happy to have it. And number 2 is Ostrich Horse, so 3 mana for a 3/1, but when it enters, you mill 3 cards, and you can put a land from among them into your hand. So it gets you a little bit of card advantage because it replaces itself with a land, and if you don't happen to hit a land, or maybe you don't need a land at the time, you can put a +1/+1 counter onto the Ostrich Horse as well. So just make a 3 mana 4/2, but a lot of the time you're going to be very happy having that land. And then at number 3 is Rebellious Captives. So for 2 mana, you get a 2/2. So just the classic early game stats. It's an ally, so that's going to be good for the decks that care about that. And then in the late game, when you draw your 2-drops, sometimes they would be less relevant. But in this case, it has Exhaust 6, which means it's an activated ability you can only use once. But you put 2 +1/+1 counters onto the Rebellious Captives, and then you Earthbend 2. So you get to add 4 more power and 4 more toughness to the battlefield, spread out across an extra body as well because of the Earthbending, and that's just pretty nice to have as an option on your 2-drop that maybe would have fallen off in terms of relevance in the late game. Moving on to the archetype overviews, kicking things off with red-white. At first up, we have Sun Warriors. This is the archetype that cares about getting a lot of creatures into play to pressure your opponents and win the game, and Sun Warriors is perfect for that. It's a 4-mana 3/5 and firebends X, where X is the number of creatures you control, which can add a substantial amount of mana. Just imagine you go 2-drop, 3-drop, Sun Warriors, all of a sudden you're firebending 3, and it has the activated ability to pay 5 mana to create a 1/1. So you can just grow that number of creatures you have. Then you can use firebending for even higher numbers, and then you can use the firebending to pay to make more creatures. So it's a really nice synergistic card that also goes well with the other cards that care about having a lot of creatures in play. Like Jet, Freedom Fighter. So it has hybrid mana, so you could play this in decks that aren't red-white. That's going to be a theme of all the hybrid mana cards we see, but it fits especially well into red-white. So for 2, then red-white, red-white, red-white. So with hybrid mana, you can pay either red or white mana to cast it. You get a 3/1, and when he enters, he deals damage equal to the number of creatures you control to target creature an opponent control. So when you have a few creatures in play, Jet's going to be coming into play, killing one of your opponent's creatures, and then when he dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures, so turning your other creatures a little bit bigger when Jet does get taken out. And then finally, Team Avatar is really nice if you have a bunch of creatures in play, because whenever it attacks alone, it gets +X until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. So if you have a bunch of 1/1s, all of a sudden they're all must-answer threats, because if you have like 4 creatures in play, they're just getting absolutely huge when they attack. And you also have the option of paying 3 mana and discarding it to deal damage equal to the number of creatures you control to target creatures. So it's a removal spell or a way to win a board stall. Next up is Blue-Black, which is a control deck that cares about drawing multiple cards in a turn on some of its payoffs. So Foggy Swamp Spirit Keeper, nice little 3-mana 2/4 lifelinker that gets you a bit of 1/1 army building when you are able to draw your second card each turn, which is quite nice. It's important to note that it's your second card each turn, so if you somehow draw 2 cards on your turn and 2 cards on your opponent's turn, you can kind of trigger it multiple times in a cycle, which is pretty nice to know. Knowledge Seeker is a nice 2-drop that's going to be a growing threat that when it dies, you create a clue token, and that clue token can then be used to draw multiple cards in a future turn, which is pretty nice. Like you draw your card, sacrifice a clue token, that's your second card. And then it's important to remember this is also just a control deck, so a card like Hama the Bloodbender as a top-end card that's going to be able to enter, get some value from your opponent's deck, and just be a powerful top-end threat is still going to be the sort of thing you're looking for in your blue-black deck. Next up is Green-White, which is a deck that cares about allies. So White Lotus Reinforcements is a 3-mana 2/3 that buffs your other allies. Suki Kyoshi Warrior is a 4-mana star 4 with power equal to the number of creatures you control, and when it attacks, you create an ally creature token. So if you have cards that care about allies entering, or you have cards that buff your allies, Suki's going to make you a bunch of those allies and also be a growing threat as a result of the fact that you're making more bodies. And then Haru Hidden Talent is one of those cards that cares about when other allies enters. So when another ally enters, you earthbend 1. So you play this on turn 2, and then you just start playing allies. And every time you get an ally into play, you're going to get an extra counter onto one of your lands. So that's going to be pretty nice as well. Next up is Red-Blue, which is a deck that cares about casting lessons and non-creature spells. So a card like Dragonfly Swarm is a 3-mana star 3 with flying and ward 1, and its power is equal to the number of non-creature, non-land cards in your graveyard. So you want to be casting those instants and sorceries to fill up your graveyard, and when it dies, if there's a lesson card in your graveyard, you draw a card. And a lot of the instants and sorceries in this set are lessons, so while you're growing its power, you're presumably going to be able to get that lesson in your graveyard to draw a card if your opponent is able to kill it. A really nice lesson for this deck is Combustion Technique, 2-mana instant. It deals damage equal to 2 plus the number of lesson cards in your graveyard to target creature, and then if that creature would die, it gets exiled. So it's a 2-mana deal 2, but when you're building your deck to fill your deck with lessons and instants and sorceries that are lessons, you're going to be able to make Combustion Technique a lot better. And then Serpent of the Past is a really nice top-end card for this deck, because it's going to cost less mana for each non-creature, non-land in your graveyard, and since a lot of them are going to be lessons, you're often going to be able to cast it with Flash as a giant 6/5 creature that can maybe gobble up one of your opponent's creatures in combat, so that's pretty nice to be aware of. Next is Black-Green, which is a deck that cares about +1/+1 counters. So Daily Agents is a really nice top-end card for this deck. At 5 mana, you come into play as a 3/4, and then you Earthbend 1 and Earthbend 1 again. So you can, when you Earthbend, you're allowed to put the counters onto a card that's already been Earthbended onto. So you can basically have Daily Agents come into play with a 2/2 Earthbended land, or you can spread that out to get multiple cards with counters on them, which is nice flexibility, especially because when it attacks, they're going to lose X life and you gain X life, where X is the number of creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them. So if you spread those around, it makes the Daily Agents a little bit better, but of course, every situation will be a bit different. Long Fang is another way to get +1/+1 counters on your creatures. So when another creature you control or land is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you put a counter on a creature you control. So that's a nice way to get counters spread around. And then Earth Kingdom General is a nice way to gain some life while you are are getting those counters. So when it enters, you Earthbend 2, and when you put one or more counters on a creature, you gain that much life. And you do that only once per turn, but that's a nice way to help win in racing situations where you're gaining some life while you're growing your creatures with those counters. Next is Blue-White, which is a deck that cares about flyers. So Air Nomad Legacy is perfect for this deck because it's a 2-drop that makes creature with the flying you control get +1/+1, and it even makes it clue when it enters, so that's going to be able to replace itself. There's Momo Playful Pet, which is a really nice 1-drop for this deck. It's a flyer, it's got vigilance. When it leaves the battlefield, you get to do a host of cool things like making food, putting a counter on a creature, or scrying 2. It's also worth noting that if you airbend Momo away, it doesn't say when it dies, it's just when it leaves the battlefield. So if Momo happens to leave play from getting airbended away or from it getting bounced or something like that, you'll still get to use the leave the battlefield trigger. And then Teo Spirited Glider is also nice because when you have a creature with flying attack, you get to draw and discard and even potentially grow one of your creatures. So that's pretty nice as well, especially because you can maybe go 2-drop flyer or something like that, or maybe a 3-drop flyer, then play Teo and immediately trigger it by attacking with one of your other flyers. Next is Green-Red, which is a deck that cares about having creatures with power 4 or greater. So Bitter Work is a nice 3-drop enchantment for this deck. When you attack a player with one or more creatures with power 4 or greater, you draw a card. So that's going to be nice to keep the card advantage flowing in a color combination that doesn't always get access to as much card advantage. And it has Exhaust 4, you can Earthbend 4, so you can make one of those 4-powered creatures. And remember that Earthbended creatures will have haste. So if you draw Bitter Work in the mid-game or you have it in play, you can potentially then trigger it immediately by Earthbending 4, putting the counters onto a land that's untapped, and then attacking your opponent to get that ability. Tiger Dillo is a nice little 2-drop for this deck because you're hopefully going to be able to get 4-powered creatures into play, and that means that you'll be able to get your 2-mana 4/3 rolling and able to attack and block. So you really just want to make sure you can enable this, but if you can, you get a 2-mana creature that's got a pretty sizable amount of stats. And then Flopsy Boomy's Buddy is a really nice finisher for this deck because it grows all of your creatures, so even creatures that weren't 4-power already might get there when it enters and puts a counter on each creature you control, which is importantly also going to put a counter onto Flopsy because it just says on each creature, and then each creature with power 4 or greater can't be blocked by more than one creature. So that's going to be pretty substantial, make it really hard for your opponent to deal with your stuff because they aren't going to be able to double block you and things like that. Next up is White-Black, which is a deck that cares about sacrifice. So Tolls of War is a really nice 2-drop for this deck. When it enters, you make a clue, and then when you sacrifice a permanent during your turn, you create a 1/1 ally creature token. So you're going to be able to make that clue token, sacrifice clues, create 1/1s. If you sacrifice those 1/1s, you're going to create another 1/1. It only triggers once each turn, but it's going to be something you're going to be trying to trigger every turn in this deck if you can. Hey Bye, Spirit of Balance is a nice 4-drop. It can grow when you sacrifice things to it, and then when it leaves, you can put its counter onto a different creature. So you can grow the Hey Bye and then create another huge threat when Hey Bye leaves. And sometimes if you have Hey Bye in play and some other way to sacrifice creatures, then all of your creatures are somewhat scary because your opponent never knows when Hey Bye is going to leave to put its counters onto something else. June Bounty Hunter is a really good 2-drop for this deck because it's going to let you sacrifice your creatures and create clue tokens with them. So you can turn your 1/1s into clues, and then you can sacrifice those clue tokens to other things, and then it's going to give you a lot of sacrifice synergy. Next up is Blue-Green, which is a deck that cares about getting lessons and ramping. So Hermetic Herbalist is a really nice 2-drop. It's a 2-mana, 2/3, great stats. Add 1 mana of any color, but you can add 2 mana in any combo of colors to cast lesson spells. So you're going to be able to use those lessons, like Accumulate Wisdom, which is a really good lesson for this deck because you're going to be getting lots of lessons. And when you play it in the late game, you're going to be able to draw a bunch of cards with it because you look at the top 3 and you put 1 into your hand if you don't have 3 lessons in your graveyard. But if you do have 3 lessons in your graveyard, it's just a 2-mana draw 3, which is just perfect because you want to be getting those lessons into your deck. And then Boomy, King of the 3 Trials, is a nice top-end card for this deck because if you have a bunch of lessons in your graveyard, you're just going to be able to make a 6-mana 7/7 that scries 3 and Earthbends 3, which is a huge amount of stats and just value from the scry. So that's the sort of card that's a really good top-end threat for this deck that cares about lessons and ramp. Next and finally is Black-Red, which is a deck that cares about firebending and being aggressive. So Cruel Administrator is a really nice top-end card for this deck. If you raid, which means you had a creature attack this turn, so this creature enters with a counter on it if you attack this turn. So it's a 5-mana 6/5 then. And when it attacks, you create a 2/2 red soldier creature token with firebending 1. So it's like a growing number of, it's like an army making card, and it's going to be pretty reasonably statted. It's a great top-end card for this deck. Azula on the Hunt comes down a little bit earlier on turn 4 and has firebending 2. And when it attacks, you lose a life and create a clue token, so a nice way to get some more firebending into your deck to just have a nice attack card that cares about attacking. This is definitely a deck that really wants to have things that help you push through attacks, like combat tricks, a nice aggressive start, early creatures, things like that, because you want to be in situations where you can attack and really leverage your firebending abilities. And then Fire Nation Attacks is a really nice card for this deck because it's an instant, so if you have some early firebenders, you can cast this before turn 5 to make a couple of 2/2s that will then have firebending 1, which will then help you flash it back for that 9 mana, which 9 mana looks like a lot, but you have to remember it's an instant, and your firebenders will help add mana temporarily during combat, so you can cast Fire Nation Attacks, either the normal mode or the flashback mode during combat potentially, thanks to the help of your firebenders that are going to be adding some mana. So that's a really nice kind of finisher for this deck as well. There is kind of a deck that's built around shrines in this deck and in this format as well, but a shrines deck is really hard to build and it's going to be very finicky. So it's more of like a for funds thing than for a like serious strategy, because there is only one shrine in each color at common or uncommon. There's going to be one shrine that you can like kind of build around. So shrines care about having a lot of shrines in play or having multiple enter. And so if you're going to try to build a shrines deck, you kind of have to be playing a bunch of colors, and that's going to be really tricky to do. There's also a few cards that care about shrines, like Aang's Journey, which can search up a basic land or a shrine, Gurupathic, which you can look at the top 5, you get a Lesson Saga or shrine, White Lotus Hideout helps you cast your shrines. But basically, this is the sort of deck where if you see a shrine or a card that talks about shrines, this is a very niche archetype rather than one of the main strategies in the format. So just keep that in mind, especially if you are only drafting this format a few times. It's going to be a relatively rare archetype because you do have to have so much come together. You have to see a lot of the shrines when they're uncommons. You have to be playing a multicolored deck. You have to have other players not trying to take the shrines, that sort of thing. So just keep that in mind, that the shrines deck is not like the main archetypes that you're going for. Next up are the combat tricks to be aware of at common and uncommon. So in white, at common, there's Yip Yip, so 1 mana +2/+2. At uncommon, there's Enter the Avatar State, which is going to give a creature flying, first strike, lifelink, and hexproof for 1 mana. And also at uncommon, there's Fancy Footwork to give 2 creatures +2/+2 and untap them. Blue has Octopus Form at common, so it's a +1/+1, gives it hexproof and untaps it. Black has Azula Always Lies, which could be really, really scary if you don't know about it, because it lets you choose one or both. A creature gets -1/-1, and put a counter on target creature. So if your opponent has a creature with 1 toughness, you can like kill their 1 toughness creature and potentially win a combat, and that can be absolutely devastating for just 2 mana. Red has Cunning Maneuver at common, +3/+1, create a clue token, so it'll replace itself. That's pretty nice. How to Start a Riot can be a mass pump spell for 3 mana, give all the creatures +2/+0. So if there's a big attack, definitely think of this card. And then Twin Blades, which gives something double strike when it enters. So that's something to be aware of as well. And it has +1/+1, so that's nice as well. And then green gets Pillar Launch, so +2/+2 and reach, and untap the creature for 1 mana, and Origin of Metal Bending. So you put a +1/+1 counter on the creature and it gains indestructible. So those are the combat tricks. Next up are some traps. So these cards aren't necessarily bad, but they could potentially fool you, or you could potentially play them incorrectly or think they work a certain way. So Watery Grasp is 1 mana. It says Enchanted creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step, and you can Waterbend 5 to have the enchanted creature's owner shuffle it into their library. Very importantly, this card doesn't tap the creature itself. So if you put this onto an untapped creature, the creature will just be sitting there untapped, and so it can still block and things like that. So if you are going to play this card, make sure that you only put it onto creatures that are already tapped, unless you already have the mana to waterbend it away or something like that, because generally speaking, these cards will tap the creature. So in this case, it doesn't tap the creature, and so that's just something that's worth noting. Next is Master Paku. So it's a 2 mana 1/3, and then it says whenever it's got prowess, and whenever it becomes tapped, target player mills X cards, where X is the number of lessons in your graveyard. And this is the only card that could really be like a mill card for milling your opponent out of the game. So if you see this card, don't think, oh, I'm going to build a mill deck. Just think, okay, maybe I'll use this to mill myself, to fill my graveyard, to give myself more instants and sorceries in the graveyard, or something like that. It's not going to be like, oh, I'm going to draft Master Paku and then I'm going to see a bunch of cards to help me build a mill deck. That's not going to be how that works. And then Rumble Arena is just a land that has vigilance, and it's got it can help you filter your mana or whatever, and scries 1 when it enters. But it's a land with vigilance, and that's just for earthbend abilities. It doesn't affect the way the land works unless you like turn it into a creature somehow. So just if you see vigilance on this land, don't get too confused. It's just going to be like a normal land, but if you do earthbend onto it, then you can use all of the benefits of vigilance. Moving on to some combos you can assemble. First up is the combo between a card like Gather the White Lotus and Energy Bending. So each of the colors has an uncommon that benefits you if you have a bunch of lands of that basic land type. So Gather the White Lotus is 5 mana. You create a 1/1 ally token for each planes you control, scry 2. So if you're playing like a mono white deck somehow, all of a sudden it's like 5 mana, you make 5/1/1s if you cast it on turn 5. but it's sometimes hard to be playing like a mono white deck that's not very common in limited. But with energy bending, lands you control gain all basic land types until end of turn, and you draw a card. And so basically, you can turn all of your lands into like all basic land types, and then your card like Gather the White Lotus will be super powered up, which is really, really cool. Next is the combo between a saga like the Cave of Two Lovers and Airbending Lesson, which is going to let you airbend the non-land permanent, as we already mentioned. With a saga, you can put the third chapter on the stack and then airbend it away, and then you can recast the saga for just 2 mana later, and that's going to be very effective because you get the full value of the saga, then you airbend and you can cast the saga again and you try to get its full value again. So that's definitely something to be aware of. And then next is the combo between Zuko's Conviction, which is an instant speed way to return a creature from your graveyard to your hand. But if you kick it, you can put that spell onto the battlefield tapped. And so for 5 mana, you can get something back into play, maybe on your opponent's end step. And sometimes it's hard to get a big creature into your graveyard, but there is a cycle of land cycling creatures. So maybe Canyon Crawler, you swamp cycle it. So now you have that big creature in your graveyard. So Zuko's Conviction will have a target. So that's definitely something that you can assemble. And then the final combo is the classic Steal and Sacrifice. Jet's Brainwashing says target creature can't block this turn, but if you kick it for 3 extra mana, you gain control of that creature until end of turn. Instead, untap it and it gains haste until end of turn, and then you're going to create a clue token. But then you have like the card Deadly Precision, which we already looked at, which you can just pay a single mana, sacrifice an artifact or creature, and destroy another target creature. So you play Jet's Brainwashing with Kicker for 4 mana, take your opponent's creature, play Deadly Precision, sacrifice it after you've hit your opponent with it, and all of a sudden you're stealing their stuff, sacrificing it, killing their other stuff. Really, really nice. Moving on to some final tips. There are tons of ways to spend extra mana, so plan accordingly. So there not only are there the firebending cards with activated abilities, the waterbend cards with activated abilities, there's also just plenty of other mana sinks in this format, and there is a cycle of lands that's going to replace the basic land in 50% of the packs, and that is another mana sink where you can spend 4, tap it, sacrifice this land to draw a card, like Meditation Pool as an example. So there's one of those for each color combination, each 2-color combination. And so there's lots of ways to spend your mana in this set, and so that means that you aren't going to maybe have to invest as heavily in getting card draw spells to make sure you can keep spending your mana, because you're going to have so much access to mana, and maybe you're not going to want to shave lands and go down to 16 lands or things like that, because there are so many things to use your mana on in the late game. It also means that if you are a control deck playing against an aggressive deck, it's not going to run out of gas as easily, so you're going to want to make sure that your control decks do have some ways to end the game themselves. And then the final tip is keep an extra card in your hand in the late game to protect yourself against black decks. There is a variant Corrupt Court Official in this format. 2 mana, 1/1 when it enters, target opponent discards a card. And it's just nice to be aware of this sort of effect, because in the late game, if you have like an important spell and you don't need the lands, just holding that extra land in your hand will protect you against your opponent playing the Corrupt Court Official in the late game and nabbing your card. Sure, in the early game, you're going to have to get rid of something maybe you care about because you care about hitting your land drops more, but just maybe keep that extra land in hand if you do have a really important spell against those black decks. That's going to do it for this video, though. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to hit that like button, subscribe for more, and comment if you have any questions or feedback. And to let me know you made it all the way to the end of the video, leave #AvatarDrafter in the comments section down below. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.